The scream came from the highest tower of the castle, and it did not stop for a long time. Guards stood outside the door with their backs pressed against the stone, none of them brave enough to look inside. Inside that room, a healer named Old Tam was losing the fight of his life, and everyone already knew how it would end. King Renard Voss sat on the edge of his bed, his shoulder torn open from a wound that refused to close. Blood soaked through cloth after cloth, yet he did not cry out. He watched Old Tam work with trembling hands, watched the old man's face turn pale, then gray, then still. By the time the healer's hands stopped moving, his skin had gone thin and papery, as if 10 years had been pulled out of him in a single moment. Renard did not move. He had seen this happen too many times to be shocked anymore. He only closed his eyes and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Take him out." 2 guards entered, careful not to touch the king, careful not to look too long at his wound. They carried Old Tam's body away, and the door shut with a heavy sound that echoed down the corridor. This was the 12th healer to die trying to save him. The curse had settled over Renard 3 winters ago, during a battle against the Ashwood Pack, a rival group that had wanted his throne and his land. In the middle of that fight, an old woman from the enemy side, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, had placed both hands on his chest as he stood over her fallen son. She had whispered something in a language Renard did not know, and from that moment, his body became a trap for anyone who tried to mend it. Every healer who touched his wounds to close them ended up giving their own life force away instead. Some died slowly over days. Others, like Old Tam, went in an instant. Word spread across every village and every kingdom nearby. They called him the Cursed Alpha King. They said his touch alone was enough to kill. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. "Do not wander to the eastern hills," they would say, "or the cursed king will find you." None of it was true in the way people imagined. Renard had never harmed an innocent person with his own hands. But the fear had grown so large that the truth no longer mattered. He was feared, and he was alone, and both of those things had become his entire life. His advisor, a steady man named Elric who had served the royal family since Renard was a boy, entered the room once the guards had gone. He did not flinch at the sight of the blood-soaked sheets. He had grown used to it, the way a person grows used to a long illness that will not end. "Your Grace," Elric said, "we cannot keep asking healers to come. Word has spread through every town within 3 days' ride. No one will answer the call anymore." "Then no one will answer," Renard said. His voice was flat, worn down from years of the same conversation. "Leave the wound. It has closed before without help. It will close again." "It has not closed on its own in over a month," Elric said gently. "You grow weaker every week. The council has noticed. The soldiers have noticed. If this continues, there will be no king to be afraid of at all." Renard did not answer. He pressed a cloth against his shoulder and stared at the dark window, where the moon hung low over the black hills. He had once been strong enough to lead armies across those hills without a single scratch. Now he could barely lift his own sword arm above his head. He thought, briefly, of simply letting the wound take him. It would be easier than watching another healer die in his place. But a king could not think that way for long, not with a kingdom depending on him, however broken that kingdom's faith in him had become. Elric left without pressing further. He knew there was no point arguing with a man who had already accepted his own end. Far from the castle, in a village called Hollow Reach that sat at the edge of a quiet forest, a young woman named Wren was grinding herbs in a small stone bowl. She worked by feel alone, her fingers finding the exact texture and weight of each plant without needing to see it. Wren had been blind since the day she was born, but no one in the village treated her as broken because of it. If anything, they treated her as something rarer, someone whose other senses had grown sharp enough to notice things sighted people missed entirely. Her guardian, an elderly herbalist named Mira, had raised her since she was found abandoned as a baby near the edge of the woods. Mira had taught her everything she knew about plants, wounds, and the quiet signs a body gives before it grows sick. Wren had learned to listen to breathing, to smell the change in sweat when fever set in, to feel the pulse in her wrist and know exactly what it meant. She could not see faces, but she could read people in a way that felt, to her, far more honest. That evening a rider came through Hollow Reach carrying an announcement from the capital. He read it aloud in the village square, his voice tight with nerves. The royal court was calling for any healer, of any skill or background, willing to travel to the castle and attempt to treat the king. There would be payment, land, protection for their family, anything a healer could want. But the rider also read the warning attached to the offer, plain and blunt. "Every healer who has tried has died. Come at your own risk." The square went silent after he finished. No one stepped forward. A few villagers murmured that they pitied whoever the rider found foolish enough to go. Ren, sitting on the steps outside Mira's small shop, listened carefully to every word. She had heard stories about the cursed king for years, the way other children in the village had been warned about him since they were small. But fear built from stories never held much weight for Ren. She could not see the monster everyone spoke of. She could only imagine him through sound and description, and something about the way people spoke of him never matched the fear in their voices. There was pity buried underneath it too, though most people did not seem to notice that themselves. That night, she sat with Mira by the fire, turning the announcement over in her mind. "I want to go," Ren said simply. Mira nearly dropped the cup she was holding. "Absolutely not, child. Every healer who touches him dies. You heard the writer yourself. I heard that every healer who touches his wounds the way they always have been touched, dies," Ren said. "That is not the same as saying every healer who tries anything at all will die." Mira set her cup down hard enough that it rattled. "You cannot know that. You are guessing, Ren, and a guess is not worth your life." Ren was quiet for a moment, running her thumb along the edge of the bowl in her lap. Then she said something that Mira would remember for a long time afterward. "I have spent my whole life reading things no one else can read. I have felt sickness in people before it ever showed on their skin. I have never once been wrong about what a body is telling me. If there is a curse in that man, I want to feel it for myself before I believe every rumor the village tells about it." Mira tried for another hour to talk her out of it, listing every danger, every terrible story the writer had shared. But Ren had already decided, and once Ren decided something, there was very little that could shift her. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Ren packed a small bag with her herbs, her tools, and a walking stick worn smooth from years of use. Mira stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes wet though she tried to hide it. "If you go," Mira said quietly, "you go carefully. You listen to every warning they give you, and if something feels wrong, truly wrong, you turn back." "I will be careful," Ren promised. "But I do not think I am walking towards something wrong. I think I am walking towards something no one has bothered to understand yet." She left Hollow Reach with the morning mist still clinging to the trees, her walking stick tapping steadily against the dirt road, each step certain despite the uncertainty of everything ahead. She could not see the road stretching out before her, the hills rising in the distance, or the dark towers of the castle far beyond them, but she could feel the direction she needed to go, and for Ren, that had always been enough. Back at the castle, Renard sat in his darkened chamber long after Elric had gone, staring at nothing, waiting for the ache in his shoulder to fade into the numbness he had grown used to. He did not know that a healer had already decided to come. He did not know that this particular healer would be unlike any who had come before her. He only knew that another day had passed, and he was still alive, and he was still alone, and for a man who had once commanded armies, that felt like the cruelest curse of all. Ren walked for 3 full days before the towers of the capital finally rose within reach of her senses, not as shapes she could see, but as a change in the air itself. The wind carried the smell of smoke, metal, and crowded streets, so different from the pine and damp earth of Hollow Reach. She followed the sound of cartwheels and distant voices, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the road. She had slept 2 nights under the open sky, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to owls and rustling leaves instead of fearing them. Fear had never come easily to Ren. She often thought that people who could see the world were also the ones who carried the most worry, because their eyes gave them so many more things to be afraid of. Ren had only sound, smell, and feeling, and none of those had ever lied to her the way stories often did. By the time she reached the outer gates of the capital, guards stopped her almost immediately. A young woman traveling alone, carrying a bag of herbs and a walking stick, drew attention in a city that had grown used to suspicion. "State your business," one guard said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I am a healer," Ren said. "I have come in answer to the call from the castle." There was a pause, then quiet laughter from the second guard, though it was not cruel laughter, more disbelief than mockery. "You cannot be serious. You are blind." "I am," Ren agreed simply. "That has never stopped me from healing anyone before." The first guard studied her for a long moment, though of course she could not see the way his expression shifted from doubt to something closer to pity. Word had spread of the desperate call sent out days earlier, and few healers had answered it at all. He finally sighed and waved her through, muttering that it was not his place to turn away anyone willing to try, blind or not. Ren was led through winding streets toward the castle, the noise of the city pressing in from every side. She listened to snippets of conversation as she passed, and more than once she heard the king's name spoken in hushed, frightened tones. A mother pulled her child closer when she overheard a whisper about ghosts wandering the castle halls. An old man muttered that the king would surely die soon, and perhaps that would be a mercy for everyone. himself included. None of it changed Ren's mind. If anything, it made her more curious. Fear, she had learned long ago, often grew loudest around things people did not understand, not around things that were truly dangerous. At the castle gates, she was stopped again, this time by a stern guard captain named Garrick, whose voice carried the weight of someone who had turned away more visitors than he could count. "Another healer," he said, though his tone made it clear he expected nothing to come of it. "Do you understand what you are walking into? 12 healers have died trying to treat him, the last one barely a week ago." "I understand," Ren said. "I still wish to try." Garrick studied her the way the guards at the outer gate had, though his gaze lingered on her unfocused eyes, the way they did not track his movements the way sighted eyes would. Something about her stillness unsettled him more than her blindness did. Most visitors who came to the castle carried nervous energy, glancing at the towers, whispering to each other about the stories they had heard. Ren carried none of that. She simply waited, calm as still water. Against his better judgment, Garrick led her inside. The halls of the castle were colder than Ren expected, both in temperature and in feeling. She noticed the way servants moved quickly and quietly, speaking only when necessary, their footsteps light, as if trying not to draw attention to themselves. She noticed the way conversations stopped entirely whenever she and Garrick passed a group of guards, replaced by an uneasy silence that lingered a moment too long. Elric met them partway through the halls, his expression a careful mixture of hope and worry that Ren could hear clearly in the rhythm of his breathing. "You are the healer who answered the call," he said. "I am," Ren replied. "My name is Ren." Elric hesitated before speaking again, his voice lower now. "I must tell you plainly, before you go any further, that every healer who has attempted to treat the king's wounds has either died or been badly harmed. I do not say this to frighten you away, only to be honest, since it seems no one else has been." "Thank you for your honesty," Ren said, "but I would still like to see him." Elric glanced at Garrick, some silent exchange passing between them, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Though I must warn you, His Majesty may refuse to see you at all. He has grown tired of hope that leads nowhere." Ren only smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I will have to be more stubborn than his tiredness." They led her up a long staircase, the air growing colder and quieter the higher they climbed, until they reached a heavy wooden door guarded by 2 soldiers who looked more exhausted than threatening. Elric knocked once, waited, then pushed the door open just enough to speak through the gap. "Your Grace, another healer has come. She insists on seeing you." There was a long pause before Renard's voice answered, rough and low, carrying none of the command it must have once held. "Send her away, like the others. I do not wish for another death on my hands today." Elric hesitated, glancing back at Ren, clearly expecting her to turn and leave without protest, as any reasonable person might. Instead, Ren stepped forward, gently but firmly moving past Elric toward the open door. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady and unbothered by his warning, "I have not come to heal you the way the others tried. I have come to understand what is happening to you first. If after that you still wish for me to leave, I will go without argument." Silence stretched from the other side of the door, long enough that Elric shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to intervene. Then, finally, Renard's voice came again, quieter this time, almost curious despite himself. "You are not afraid." "I have never seen anything to be afraid of," Ren said simply. "I am blind, Your Majesty. Whatever monster the stories describe, I cannot see it. I can only feel what is truly there." Another pause, longer this time. Then the door creaked open wider, though no one had touched it from the inside. Elric's eyebrows rose in surprise, glancing toward Garrick, who looked equally startled. "Come in then," Renard said at last, weary resignation coloring his voice. "If you insist on wasting your time." Ren stepped forward without hesitation, her walking stick tapping softly against the stone floor as she crossed the threshold into the dim, quiet room. Behind her, Elric let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, uncertain whether he had just witnessed something foolish or something extraordinary, though some part of him suspected it might be both. The room smelled of old bandages, dried herbs long past their use, and something faintly metallic underneath it all, a smell Ren recognized instantly as blood that had not fully healed. She stood just past the doorway, letting the space settle around her the way she always did in a new room, mapping it out through sound and scent rather than sight. The bed was to her left, she could tell from the shift of weight and the faint creak of old wood. A window stood somewhere ahead, letting in a thin draft of cool night air. And there, seated at the edge of the bed, breathing slow and heavy, sat the king himself. You may as well come closer, Renard said, his voice carrying a tired edge of sarcasm. I promise I am too weak to do you any harm, even if I wished to. Ren walked forward, her steps unhurried, until she stood only a few feet from him. She could hear his breathing clearly now, uneven, strained, the kind of breathing that came from pain long endured rather than pain freshly felt. Beneath that, she caught the scent of infection beginning to creep into a wound that had never been given the chance to close. You do not sound like a monster, she said. Renard let out a short, humorless laugh. Looks can be deceiving, though I suppose that particular saying means very little to you. More than you might think, Ren said. I have learned that voices deceive far less than faces do, and yours does not sound like the voice of something wanting to cause harm. It sounds like the voice of someone very tired of being feared. Something in Renard's breathing shifted, the pace slowing slightly. Though whether from surprise or discomfort, Ren could not yet tell. You speak boldly for someone who has just met a man 12 healers have died trying to save. I have not come to heal your wound the way they did, Ren said. I would like to touch it first, only to understand it, if you allow me. Renard was silent for a long moment. Elric, still lingering near the doorway, shifted nervously, clearly ready to intervene if needed, though some quiet curiosity kept him rooted in place as well. Do you understand what happens to those who touch me while trying to heal? Renard asked quietly. Their strength drains from their body into mine, and they wither in front of my eyes. I have watched it happen more times than any man should have to witness. I understand what you believe happens, Ren said carefully, but I have spent my whole life reading what a body tells me, and I have never once been wrong about it. If I am wrong this time, then I accept whatever comes, but I do not believe I am. Renard studied her for a long moment, though of course she could not see the conflict playing across his tired face, the exhaustion warring with something that almost resembled hope, a feeling he had learned to distrust years ago. Very well, he said finally, his voice quieter now. Try, if you must. I am too weary to argue further. Ren stepped closer, setting her bag down gently beside her, and reached her hand out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wished. He did not. Her fingers found his shoulder first, feeling the rough edge of the bandage wrapped loosely around it, soaked through in places with old blood. She peeled the bandage back carefully, her fingers moving with practiced gentleness, until she reached the wound itself. It was warm beneath her touch, swollen at the edges, the skin around it tight and inflamed. She pressed her palm flat against it, steady and unafraid, waiting. Elric took an involuntary step forward, his breath catching, half expecting to see her crumble the way the others had. Renard's own breath caught as well, his body tensing, waiting for the familiar pull he had felt so many times before, the sensation of something being drawn from him into whoever dared to touch his wound. But nothing came. Ren remained exactly as she had been, steady, calm, her hand resting against his skin without so much as a tremor. Seconds passed, then a full minute, and still nothing happened. No draining, no withering, no sudden weakness overtaking her the way it had overtaken every healer before her. Renard stared down at her hand against his shoulder, his mind struggling to understand what his body was telling him. There was no pull, no pain beyond the ordinary ache of the wound itself, only warmth and pressure, and something that almost felt like relief. Elric let out a shaky breath from the doorway, his hand pressed flat against his own chest as though steadying his racing heart. How? Renard finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this possible? Ren tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. I do not know yet, she admitted honestly, but I do know this. Whatever it is that has been taking the strength of everyone who has touched you, it is not happening to me, and I intend to understand why before I decide what to do next. Renard said nothing for a long moment, staring at the place where her hand still rested against his skin, feeling something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. It was not quite hope. It was something smaller, more careful than that, but it was there, quiet and undeniable, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence in the room did not feel like the silence of another ending. It felt, strangely, like the beginning of something else entirely. Word of what happened in the king's chamber spread through the castle faster than anyone expected, though no one quite understood how to explain it. A healer had touched the king's wound and lived. Not only lived, but showed no sign of weakness at all. By morning, servants whispered about it in the kitchens. Guards spoke of it quietly during their shifts, glancing toward the tower where the king's chamber sat, as though expecting the sky itself to change because of it. Elric, still shaken by what he had witnessed, arranged for Ren to stay in a small room near the physician's quarters, far more comfortable than anything she had expected. She did not ask for luxury, only a quiet space to store her herbs and rest between visits to the king. But Elric insisted, treating her with a level of care that made it clear he understood the importance of what she had done, even if he did not yet understand how she had done it. The following morning, Ren returned to the king's chamber, this time without needing Elric or Garrick to escort her. The guards outside the door, though still wary, stepped aside without argument, some quiet mixture of curiosity and cautious hope guiding their movements. Renard was seated by the window when she entered, though he could not see much through it beyond gray clouds and distant hills. He turned his head slightly at the sound of her footsteps, though his voice, when he spoke, still carried the same guarded weariness from the night before. "You came back," he said, as though he had expected otherwise. "I told you I would," Ren replied simply, setting her bag down near the small table by his bed. "I do not make promises I have no intention of keeping." She began unpacking a few of her herbs, working quietly as she spoke, her fingers moving with familiar precision despite never having seen this particular room before. Renard watched her with a strange, quiet fascination, unused to anyone moving through his space so calmly, without fear coloring every motion. "May I ask you something?" he said finally, after a long silence had settled between them. "You may ask," Ren said, "though I cannot promise I will have the answer." "How is it that you are not afraid of me?" he asked. "Everyone who comes near me, even those sworn to protect this kingdom, cannot help the way their hands shake or their voices tighten. Yet you walked into this room as though I were no different from anyone else you have ever treated." Ren considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words the way she chose her herbs, deliberately and without waste. "I think," she said slowly, "that fear often comes from what people imagine rather than what is actually there. I cannot see your face, so I have never had the chance to imagine a monster behind it. All I have is your voice, your breathing, the way your heartbeat steadies or quickens depending on what we speak about. None of that has ever told me to be afraid." Renard was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words slowly, as though turning them over in his mind the way one might turn over an unfamiliar stone. "You make it sound simple," he said eventually. "Perhaps it is simple," Ren said, "though I understand why it might not feel that way to you. You have spent years being told you are something to fear. It cannot be easy to separate that from who you actually are." Renard's jaw tightened slightly, an old ache surfacing in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical wound. "No," he admitted quietly, "it is not easy at all." She continued working through the morning, checking his wound again, cleaning it gently with a mixture of herbs she had prepared, noting every small detail her fingers picked up along the way. The swelling had lessened slightly overnight, though the wound itself remained far from healed. She noticed something else as well, something she had felt faintly the night before but had not yet understood. There was a strange energy beneath his skin, subtle but present, different from anything she had ever felt in another person before. It was not quite pain, not quite illness, but something tangled and knotted, as though a part of him were holding on to something too tightly to let it heal properly. "Your wound is strange," she said carefully, choosing not to alarm him unnecessarily. "It behaves differently than any injury I have treated before. I do not think it is only physical." Renard's breathing shifted slightly at her words, though he said nothing at first. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now, more careful. "I am not certain yet," Ren admitted, "but I believe there may be more beneath this curse than simple magic. Something tied to feeling perhaps, grief, or guilt, or something similar. I have felt such things in other patients before, though never quite like this." Renard's silence stretched long enough that Ren almost thought he would refuse to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual guarded edge, replaced instead by something rawer, more exposed. "There was someone," he said quietly. "A packmate, someone I fought beside for years, someone I failed to protect during the battle where this curse first took hold. I have not spoken of it to anyone since that day." Ren did not press him further, sensing the fragile weight behind his words. Instead, she simply continued her work, her hands steady and gentle, offering silence as its own kind of comfort. She had learned long ago that some wounds needed careful hands, others needed only someone willing to sit quietly beside them until they were ready to be spoken aloud. For the first time in 3 long years, Renard allowed himself to sit with someone who did not flinch away from him, who did not treat his pain as something separate from himself to be feared and avoided. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand shape of his troubles, but it was the first small thing that had felt like progress in longer than he could remember, and for a man who had almost forgotten what progress felt like, it was enough to hold on to for one more day. Over the following days, Ren settled into a steady routine at the castle, one that surprised everyone, including herself. Each morning, she visited Renard's chamber, cleaning his wound, checking the strange energy she had felt beneath his skin, and each day, that energy seemed to shift slightly, though she could not yet explain exactly why. She began paying closer attention to patterns others had overlooked entirely. The wound worsened whenever Renard grew quiet and withdrawn, retreating into memories he refused to speak aloud. It eased slightly on days when he spoke more openly, even if only about small things, the weather, old memories of his childhood, the way his kingdom had once thrived before fear had settled over it like a heavy fog. "I have noticed something," she told him one afternoon, as she carefully changed the bandage around his shoulder. "Your wound reacts to your mood. When you are troubled, it grows worse. When you allow yourself to speak freely, even a little, it grows calmer." Renard frowned, though there was no anger in the expression, only confusion. "That makes no sense. A curse does not care whether I am troubled or calm." "Perhaps this curse does," Ren said thoughtfully. "I do not believe every curse works the same way. Some are built from pure magic, cold and unfeeling. Others, I think, are shaped by something more personal, something tied to the person who cast it, and to whatever pain surrounded that moment." Renard was silent for a long moment, his hand curling slightly into the blanket beneath him. "The woman who cursed me," he said finally, "was the mother of the packmate I could not save. She watched her son die in that battle, and moments later, she placed her hands on my chest and spoke words I did not understand. I always believed it was simple vengeance, nothing more." "Perhaps it began as vengeance," Ren said gently, "but grief and vengeance often tangle together in ways even the person casting them does not fully understand. If her curse was born from grief as much as anger, it may be tied to unresolved pain rather than pure magic alone. And unresolved pain, in my experience, often needs to be faced rather than simply endured." Renard's expression darkened slightly, old guilt surfacing behind his tired eyes. "You are suggesting I am the one keeping this curse alive?" "I am suggesting," Ren said carefully, "that perhaps healing you requires more than herbs and steady hands. Perhaps it requires you to finally face what happened that day, rather than carrying it silently the way you have for 3 years. Renard turned his face away from her, staring toward the window instead, though of course she could not see the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of old grief crossing his features. "It is not so simple," he said quietly. "I was his commander. I gave the order that led him into that fight. I have carried that weight every single day since, and no amount of speaking about it will change what happened." "No," Ren agreed softly. "It will not change what happened, but perhaps it will change how you carry it. There is a difference between carrying grief and being crushed beneath it." Renard did not answer right away, though something in his posture shifted slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. Whether from her words or simply from being heard without judgment, Ren could not be certain. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer, drifting beyond the wound itself into quieter, more personal territory. Renard found himself speaking about things he had never shared with anyone, not even Elric, who had served him faithfully for years. He spoke of the packmate he had lost, a young man named Dorian who had fought beside him since childhood, someone who had trusted Renard's judgment completely, right up until the moment that trust had cost him his life. Ren listened without interrupting, offering quiet questions here and there, careful never to press too hard, understanding instinctively when to speak and when to simply let silence hold space for him to continue on his own. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own life as well, stories of growing up in Hollow Reach, of Mira's patient teaching, of the quiet confidence she had built despite a world that often underestimated her because of her blindness. Renard listened closely to these stories, finding himself drawn not only to her steady calm, but to the quiet strength woven through everything she said. One evening, as she finished tending to his wound, which had noticeably improved over the past several days, Renard spoke without quite meaning to, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I do not know what to make of you," he admitted. "Everyone else in this castle treats me as something to be feared, or something to be pitied. You treat me as neither." Ren smiled faintly as she gathered her things. "Perhaps that is because I do not see you as either of those things," she said simply. "I see you as someone in pain, carrying a burden far heavier than anyone realizes. That does not make you a monster, and it does not make you helpless either. It simply makes you human." Renard did not answer immediately, though something in his chest loosened at her words, a tightness he had carried for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like without it. As Ren left the room that evening, he found himself staring at the closed door long after she had gone, turning her words over in his mind, wondering, for the first time in years, if perhaps healing was not as impossible as he had once believed. 3 weeks passed since Ren first arrived at the castle, and in that time, something had shifted within its walls that no one could quite explain, yet everyone could feel. Renard's wound, once swollen and infected beyond reason, had closed almost entirely, leaving only a faint scar where it had once threatened to end his life. His strength had returned steadily, enough that he could walk the length of the castle halls without growing breathless, enough that his advisors began whispering with quiet, cautious hope rather than the resigned dread that had colored their conversations for years. Elric, more than anyone, watched the change with quiet amazement. He had served Renard since childhood, had watched him grow from an eager young alpha into a broken king isolated by fear and grief. To see him laugh, even quietly, even rarely, felt like witnessing something he had long given up hope of seeing again. "She has done what none of us could," Elric said one evening, as he and Garrick stood watch near the outer hall. 12 healers came before her, each promising a cure, each leaving nothing behind but grief and empty promises. Yet somehow, a blind Omega with no formal training has done what all of them failed to do. Garrick grunted in quiet agreement, though his expression remained thoughtful rather than fully convinced. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "though I wonder how much of this the council will accept without suspicion. Miracles are rarely trusted the way ordinary explanations are." Elric's brow furrowed slightly at that, though he said nothing further, some quiet unease settling into his thoughts despite the genuine hope he felt for his king's recovery. That unease was not unfounded. Among the king's council sat a nobleman named Callum, ambitious and calculating, who had long hoped that Renard's curse would eventually claim his life, opening a path for Callum's own influence to grow within the kingdom's fractured leadership. He had spent years quietly building alliances among the frightened and the desperate, positioning himself as a steady hand ready to guide the kingdom once its cursed king finally succumbed to his wounds. News of Renard's improving health did not sit well with him at all. Callum requested a private audience with the king only days after Ren's arrival became widely known throughout the castle. He entered Renard's chamber with practiced concern etched carefully across his face, though beneath that concern lay something far colder and more calculating. "Your Grace," he began smoothly, "I am relieved beyond words to see you looking so improved. The kingdom has feared for your health for far too long." Renard studied him carefully, long accustomed to the careful performances of court politics. "Yes," he said simply, "I imagine many have feared for my health, for reasons not entirely tied to concern for my well-being." Callum's expression flickered only slightly before smoothing back into practiced calm. "I only wish to understand how this healer accomplished what 12 others could not," he continued. "It seems, forgive me for saying so, rather unusual that a blind Omega with no formal training or lineage would succeed where trained physicians and skilled healers failed entirely." Renard's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the careful edge hidden beneath Callum's polite curiosity. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I suggest nothing," Callum said quickly, though his tone made it clear he suggested a great deal. "I only wonder whether her success might stem from something other than skill alone. Perhaps something closer to witchcraft, or dark magic of her own. It would explain her strange immunity to a curse that has claimed the lives of so many skilled healers before her." Renard's jaw tightened, old protective instincts surfacing sharply despite his weakened state. "You would accuse the one person who has actually helped me of practicing dark magic, simply because her success does not fit neatly into your expectations?" "I accuse no one," Callum said smoothly, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of practiced innocence. "I only urge caution, Your Grace. The kingdom has suffered greatly under fear and suspicion these past years. It would be unwise to trade one danger for another without careful investigation first." Renard said nothing further, though something in his expression made it clear the conversation had ended, as far as he was concerned. Callum bowed politely and excused himself from the chamber, though the moment the door closed behind him, his carefully practiced concern melted away entirely, replaced by cold, calculating thought. He had not expected the healer to succeed so thoroughly, nor had he expected Renard's health to improve so quickly. If the king recovered fully, Callum's carefully built plans for eventual influence would crumble entirely. He needed another approach, one that would remove the healer's influence without drawing suspicion directly toward himself. By the following morning, quiet rumors had already begun spreading through the castle's servant quarters, carefully seated by Callum's own trusted allies. Whispers questioned how a blind healer with no formal training could possibly succeed where trained physicians had failed. Some whispered of witchcraft. Others whispered darker things still, questioning whether her immunity to the curse suggested a connection to whatever dark magic had created it in the first place. Ren, unaware of the rumors slowly spreading through the castle's shadows, continued her quiet work each day, focused entirely on Renard's healing, and the deeper mystery still tangled beneath his curse. She could not yet see the storm quietly gathering around her, carried on whispers she could not hear and suspicions she could not sense the way she sensed illness or pain. But storms, however quiet in their beginning, rarely remained quiet for long, and somewhere within the castle's ambitious shadows, one was already beginning to take shape. The whispers reached Ren nearly a week later, though not directly. She first noticed the shift in the way servants spoke around her, their voices growing quieter whenever she entered a room, footsteps hurrying away rather than lingering the way they once had. She had always relied on sound to understand the world around her, and the sudden change in tone was impossible to miss. "Something has changed," she said one afternoon, as she sat across from Renard while he ate slowly, his appetite finally returning after weeks of illness. "The servants speak differently around me now, quieter, more careful." Renard's expression tightened slightly, though he had hoped to shield her from the rumors a little longer. "There have been whispers," he admitted reluctantly. "Foolish ones, spread by those uncomfortable with what they cannot easily explain." "What sort of whispers?" Ren asked, though something in her steady voice suggested she had already guessed the shape of it. Renard sighed, setting his utensils down. "Some question how you succeeded where others failed. A few have suggested it may be tied to magic of your own, rather than simple skill." Ren was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words carefully. "That does not surprise me," she said eventually. "People often fear what they cannot explain, and explanations are far easier to accept when they come wrapped in suspicion rather than curiosity." "You do not seem troubled by it," Renard said, watching her closely. "I am troubled," Ren admitted honestly, "though not for my own sake alone. I worry what such rumors might mean for you, especially if they grow loud enough to reach ears eager to use them against your recovery." Renard's jaw tightened at that, old protective instincts flaring sharply. "No one will harm you while I still draw breath," he said firmly, his voice carrying more strength than it had in weeks. Ren smiled faintly at the fierceness in his tone, though she said nothing further on the matter, choosing instead to return to her work, checking his wound one final time before the day's light faded entirely. That evening, however, matters grew far more serious than either of them expected. Elric arrived at Renard's chamber later than usual, his expression grave and hurried, clearly carrying news he did not wish to deliver. "Your Grace," he said quickly, "forgive the intrusion, but Callum has requested an emergency council meeting. He intends to formally accuse the healer of practicing forbidden magic against the crown." Renard rose from his seat immediately, ignoring the faint protest of his healing shoulder. "On what grounds?" he demanded. "He claims her immunity to the curse cannot be explained through skill alone," Elric said. "He intends to argue that she has bewitched your Grace's judgment, and that her continued presence poses a danger to the kingdom's stability." Renard's expression darkened considerably, anger sharpening his tired features. "This is absurd. She has done nothing but heal me, carefully and honestly, while every trained physician before her failed entirely." "I agree, Your Grace," Elric said quickly, "though I fear Callum has spent considerable time building support among council members uneasy with recent changes. If this accusation reaches formal proceedings, it may prove difficult to dismiss without proper explanation for her unusual immunity." Ren, who had remained quietly listening throughout their exchange, finally spoke, her voice calm despite the tension gathering in the room. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "it is time I understood that immunity myself, rather than simply accepting it without explanation. If I can uncover the true nature of this curse, perhaps I can offer the council something more convincing than mere accusation." Renard turned toward her, his expression softening slightly despite his anger. "You believe you can find answers Callum cannot twist against you?" "I believe," Ren said carefully, "that the truth, once fully understood, is far harder to twist than rumor and suspicion. And I believe this curse has secrets neither of us have fully uncovered yet." Elric nodded slowly, though worry remained etched clearly across his features. "The council meeting has been set for 3 days from now. If you intend to find answers, I fear you have very little time to do so." Ren's expression remained steady despite the pressure now resting squarely on her shoulders. 3 days, she repeated quietly. "It will have to be enough." That night, long after Elric had departed and the castle had grown quiet around them, Ren remained in Renard's chamber longer than usual, her mind turning carefully over everything she had learned about his curse so far. The strange energy beneath his skin, the way his wound responded to emotion rather than simple physical care, the grief he carried surrounding Dorian's death, all of it tangled together in ways she still did not fully understand. "I need to know more about the woman who cursed you," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Her name, her history, Anything that might explain the true nature of what she cast upon you. Renard considered her question carefully before answering. Her name was Elsbeth, he said quietly. She led a small healing circle among the Ashwood pack before the battle that claimed her son's life. I know little else about her, only that her grief that day was immense, and her anger toward me immeasurable. A healing circle, Ren repeated thoughtfully, turning the words over in her mind. That is significant. Healers who work with grief and loss often understand magic tied to emotion, far more deeply than those who study curses built from pure malice alone. If Elsbeth's curse was shaped by grief rather than simple vengeance, it may hold weaknesses grief itself creates. Weaknesses perhaps only fully understood by facing that same grief honestly. Renard's expression grew troubled at her words, old guilt surfacing once again behind his tired eyes. You believe I must face what happened to Dorian directly, rather than simply carrying the memory silently as I have done. I believe, Ren said gently, that the answer to breaking this curse lies somewhere within that grief, yours and Elsbeth's both. And I believe we have very little time left to uncover it before Callum's accusations threaten everything we have worked toward these past weeks. Renard fell silent, staring toward the window where moonlight spilled softly across the stone floor, old memories stirring uncomfortably within him. For 3 years, he had buried his guilt beneath silence and isolation, convinced that facing it directly would only deepen the pain rather than ease it. Now, with time running short and everything he had slowly rebuilt hanging delicately in the balance, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that silence had never truly protected him at all. It had only kept him trapped, exactly where his grief wanted him to remain. The following morning, Ren asked Renard to take her to the place where the battle against the Ashwood pack had taken place, a request that clearly unsettled him, though he did not refuse. The battlefield sat nearly half a day's ride from the castle, quiet now, overtaken by wild grass and scattered wildflowers that had grown steadily over the years since the fighting ended. Renard insisted on accompanying her himself, despite Elric's concern over his still healing strength. Garrick rode alongside them as well, watchful and quiet, though his earlier skepticism toward Ren had softened considerably over the past weeks, replaced by cautious respect for what she had accomplished. The ride was mostly silent, tension coiling steadily within Renard the closer they drew toward the old battlefield. Ren, seated beside him, said little as well, though she listened carefully to the shift in his breathing, the way his hands tightened slightly around the reins as memories long buried began stirring closer to the surface. When they finally arrived, Renard helped her down carefully, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary around hers, though neither of them commented on it. The field stretched quietly around them, peaceful now in a way that felt almost cruel given what had once happened there. This is the place, he said quietly, his voice tight with old grief. Ren nodded slowly, kneeling down to press her palm against the cool earth beneath them, feeling for whatever energy might still linger within the soil itself. She had learned long ago that places touched by strong emotion often carried faint traces of that feeling long after the moment itself had passed, much like a wound that continued aching long after the injury had closed. Faint traces of grief lingered here, tangled with something else, something colder and more desperate, though she could not yet identify exactly what it was. Tell me what happened, she said gently, still kneeling with her palm pressed against the earth. All of it, exactly as you remember it, even the parts you have never spoken aloud before. Renard was silent for a long moment, old resistance warring visibly against his desire to finally release the weight he had carried alone for far too long. Eventually, haltingly at first, he began to speak. He described the chaos of that final clash, the confusion of shifting battle lines, the desperate order he had given Dorian to hold a narrow pass alone, while the rest of their forces regrouped elsewhere. He had believed, in that moment, that it was the wisest strategic choice available to him. He had not known that Elsbeth's forces would break through exactly where Dorian stood, nor that his closest friend would be the one to pay the price for a decision made under the desperate pressure of battle. I told him to hold that pass, Renard said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of memory. I believed it was the right choice. I have told myself every day since that it was the right choice, strategically sound, the kind of decision any competent commander would have made. But none of that changes the fact that he died there, alone, because of an order I gave. Ren remained quiet, letting his words settle fully before speaking again. Did you go to him, afterward? She asked gently. Did you see him, before Elsbeth found you standing over her son? Renard's breath caught sharply, old grief surfacing raw and unguarded. Yes, he admitted quietly. I reached him only moments after he fell. I held him as he died. I told him I was sorry, though I do not know if he heard me before the end came. Ren's expression softened considerably at his words, understanding settling quietly within her. That grief, she said carefully. The sorrow you carried in that exact moment, standing over him, holding him as he died. That is what Elsbeth's curse latched onto when she placed her hands against your chest. Her own grief tangled directly with yours in that instant, binding the curse not to simple vengeance alone, but to your own unspoken guilt as well. Renard's eyes widened slightly, old realization dawning slowly. You believe the curse feeds on my guilt. I believe, Ren said gently, that the curse was never simply about draining strength from those who try to heal you. I believe it reflects the very thing you have refused to release since that day. Punishment you have silently accepted as deserved, carried forward through every healer who tried and failed to ease your suffering. The curse did not simply take their strength. It mirrored the punishment you believed you deserved, refusing anyone the chance to ease a burden you yourself were unwilling to set down. Renard fell to his knees beside her, the weight of her words crashing over him with sudden, undeniable clarity. 3 years, he whispered brokenly. 3 years I told myself I deserved this, that accepting the pain was the only fitting price for what happened to him. Ren reached out, finding his hand gently, holding it steady within her own. Guilt is not the same as justice, she said softly. Punishing yourself endlessly will not bring Dorian back, nor will it ease the grief Elsbeth herself still carries. If you wish to break this curse fully, I believe you must finally allow yourself to release that guilt, not because what happened did not matter, but because carrying it forever will not undo it either. Renard remained kneeling quietly beside her for a long while, the weight of years finally beginning to shift within his chest, loosening slowly with every breath. For the first time since that terrible day, he allowed himself to grieve openly, without shame, without the silent conviction that he deserved nothing but suffering in return. And somewhere beneath his skin, faint and barely perceptible, Ren felt the strange knotted energy she had sensed since their very first meeting begin, ever so slightly, to loosen as well. They returned to the castle as evening settled over the hills, Renard quieter than usual, though it was a different kind of quiet than before, softer, less burdened. Ren could hear the change clearly in his breathing, steadier now, less shadowed by the tight, guarded tension she had grown used to since their first meeting. But the peace of that evening did not last long. The moment they arrived back within the castle walls, Elric met them at the gates, his expression tense with urgency. Your Grace, he said quickly. Callum has moved the council meeting forward. It begins within the hour. He has gathered several nobles already convinced by his accusations, and I fear he intends to have the healer removed from the castle by force, if the council rules against her. Renard's expression hardened immediately, old exhaustion replaced by fierce resolve. He will not touch her, he said firmly. Gather the council. I intend to be present for this meeting myself. Ren placed a steady hand on his arm. I would like to speak as well, she said. If Callum intends to accuse me of practicing dark magic, I would rather answer him directly than hide from an accusation I know to be false. Renard studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then we face this together. The council chamber was already filled with tense murmurs by the time they arrived, nobles seated around a long table, Callum standing near its head with practiced confidence, clearly prepared to argue his case thoroughly. His expression flickered with surprise, quickly masked, upon seeing Renard enter looking far stronger than he had anticipated, Ren walking steadily beside him. Your Grace, Callum said smoothly, recovering quickly, I am relieved to see you looking well enough to attend, though I fear the matter before us remains serious regardless. Renard took his seat at the head of the table, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. Then let us address it plainly, he said. You believe this healer has practiced dark magic against the crown. I would like to hear your evidence. Callum cleared his throat, addressing the gathered nobles rather than Renard directly. 12 trained healers have died attempting to treat your Grace's curse. This woman, blind, untrained in any recognized healing tradition, succeeded without so much as a moment's hesitation. Such immunity defies explanation through skill alone. I believe it points toward magic of her own, magic that may be influencing your Grace's judgment far more than anyone realizes. Several nobles murmured in uneasy agreement, clearly swayed by Callum's carefully constructed argument. Ren stepped forward calmly before Renard could respond, her voice steady despite the weight of every gaze now settled upon her. I understand your concern, she said, addressing the council directly. Immunity that cannot be immediately explained naturally invites suspicion. But I did not succeed through magic of my own. I succeeded because I took the time to understand the true nature of this curse, something no healer before me attempted. She explained carefully, methodically, everything she had discovered, The way the curse responded to Renard's emotional state rather than simple physical injury. The connection to Elsbeth's grief, and Renard's own unspoken guilt surrounding Dorian's death. The way the curse had punished anyone who tried to ease Renard's suffering, because Renard himself had never allowed that suffering to be eased. This curse was never simple dark magic meant to kill indiscriminately, Ren continued. It was shaped by grief, bound to guilt, designed to reflect the punishment its caster believed was deserved. Every healer who touched his wound in the past attempted to heal it through physical means alone, ignoring the emotional wound tangled beneath it. My immunity comes not from magic, but from listening more carefully than those before me, understanding what the wound truly needed, rather than treating only what appeared on the surface. The council chamber fell into uneasy silence, several nobles exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for such a detailed and reasoned explanation. Callum's expression tightened, sensing his carefully built argument slipping away. "This is merely a story," he said sharply, "unprovable and convenient." "It is not merely a story," Renard interjected firmly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority for the first time in years. "I have lived this curse for 3 years. I have felt exactly what she describes, the way my wound worsened whenever guilt consumed me, the way it eased slightly whenever I allowed myself even brief moments of honesty about what happened that day. Her explanation is not convenient invention. It is the truth I have refused to face myself until she forced me to confront it directly." Callum opened his mouth to argue further, but Renard raised a hand sharply, silencing him immediately. "Enough," he said firmly. "This council will not punish the one person who has finally offered real healing, both to my body and to wounds I have carried silently for far too long. If you have genuine concerns regarding the crown's stability, address them through honest counsel rather than baseless accusation meant to protect your own ambitions." The chamber fell utterly silent at his words, several nobles shifting uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the truth behind Renard's pointed accusation. Callum's face paled slightly, though he said nothing further, understanding all too well that his carefully constructed plan had crumbled entirely beneath the weight of Renard's renewed strength and Ren's steady, reasoned defense. The council meeting ended shortly after, the matter formally dismissed, though Callum's cold, calculating stare lingered on Ren long after the chamber had emptied, a silent promise that this matter, in his mind, remained far from finished. In the days following the council meeting, Renard's recovery continued steadily, his strength returning fully for the first time in 3 years. Yet Ren noticed the strange knotted energy beneath his skin still lingered faintly, weakened considerably, but not entirely gone. She understood, without needing further explanation, that true healing required one final step neither of them had yet taken. "You must speak with Elsbeth," she told him one evening, as they sat together in the quiet garden behind the castle, a space Renard had avoided for years but had recently begun visiting again. "The curse remains tied to her grief as much as your guilt. I do not believe it will fully release, until both of you face what happened honestly, together rather than separately." Renard's expression grew troubled at the suggestion. "She may not wish to see me at all. I am the reason her son is gone." "Perhaps," Ren said gently, "though grief left unspoken often grows heavier over time rather than lighter. If there is any chance of easing both her pain and your own, I believe it is worth attempting." After careful arrangement through cautious messengers, a meeting was finally arranged between Renard and Elsbeth, held on neutral ground near the border between their territories, Ren accompanying him as steady support throughout. Elsbeth arrived looking far older than her years, grief having carved deep lines into her face over the past 3 seasons. Her eyes hardened the moment she saw Renard approaching, old anger flaring instantly to the surface. "You have some nerve, requesting this meeting," she said sharply, her voice trembling with barely restrained emotion. "I have come," Renard said quietly, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the moment, "to finally say what I should have said long ago. I am sorry, truly, deeply sorry, for the order I gave that day, for the loss you have carried because of my decision. I have carried my own grief silently for 3 years, believing silence was the only fitting punishment. I understand now that silence has never honored Dorian's memory. It has only kept both of us trapped in pain neither of us deserved to carry alone." Elsbeth's harsh expression faltered slightly, old grief surfacing visibly beneath her anger. "He was my only son," she said, her voice breaking. "I have hated you every day since, blamed you entirely for taking him from me." "I understand that hatred," Renard said gently. "I have hated myself just as fiercely these past years, but I do not believe hatred, yours or my own, will ever bring him back. I believe it has only kept both of us bound to that terrible day, unable to move forward, unable to properly grieve the way he deserved to be grieved. Tears finally spilled down Elsbeth's weathered face, years of restrained grief breaking free at last. "I did not know how else to carry this pain," she admitted brokenly. "The curse I placed on you was born from a moment of unbearable agony. I do not know if I ever truly wished you dead. I only wished for you to feel even a fraction of what I felt in that moment, losing everything that mattered most. I have felt it," Renard said softly, "every single day since. But I believe now that we both deserve the chance to finally set that pain down, not because Dorian's memory matters any less, but because carrying it forever will not honor him properly either." Elsbeth remained silent for a long moment, old grief and exhaustion visible clearly across her weathered features. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out, placing her hand gently against Renard's chest, exactly where she had placed it 3 years earlier, in fury and heartbreak. "I release this curse," she whispered quietly, her voice trembling with emotion, "not because the pain is gone, but because I am finally ready to grieve honestly, rather than through anger alone." A warm light passed briefly between them, faint but unmistakable, the strange knotted energy Ren had sensed beneath Renard's skin since their very first meeting finally unraveling completely, dissolving into nothing more than quiet, ordinary warmth. Renard let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 long years, tears slipping unnoticed down his own face as the weight finally lifted entirely from his chest. "Thank you," he said softly, to both Elsbeth and Ren alike. They returned to the castle later that evening, the curse finally broken, Renard's recovery now complete in every sense. Word spread quickly throughout the kingdom, carried on grateful whispers rather than fearful ones, of a king who had faced his own guilt honestly, and a blind healer whose steady, fearless heart had guided him toward genuine healing. Standing together in the quiet garden as the sun set gently over the hills, Renard reached for Ren's hand, holding it gently within his own. "You walked toward me when everyone else turned away," he said quietly. "You saw something in me no one else believed existed anymore. I did not need to see you to know what was true," Ren said softly, a warm smile touching her lips. "I only needed to listen, carefully and honestly, the same way I hope you will always listen to me in return." Renard smiled, warmth and gratitude filling his chest fully for the first time in years, as he gently pulled her closer, no longer the isolated, feared king he had been for so long, but simply a man finally free to be touched, finally free to be loved, standing beside the one person brave enough to walk straight toward him when the rest of the world had turned away.